bunch of people, didn't we?
Hello, my name is Cyndee Todgham Cherniak, and I am a trade lawyer with Macmillan LLP in Toronto. I am also a sales tax lawyer, but in this room I'll say other than income tax lawyer as my second hat. And we're going to pick up where the last discussion left off and answer Dick Cunningham's question, or will we?
I knew you had it in.
So rather than me taking up much more time, I will leave my prepared remarks, seeing that we can segue in from the last panel. I have two speakers on this panel. The first speaker is going to be Michal Moore, and he's a professor of energy economics and senior fellow at the University of Calgary. He's a former energy commissioner for the state of California and was chief economist for the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. He directs a research program on energy markets and is currently developing a regulatory risk evaluation model for the Marcellus Shale in collaboration with colleagues at Cornell University. And he will be speaking first. After Michal Moore, Jonathan Adler will give his remarks, and Jonathan is a professor of law and director of the Center for Business Law and Regulation at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Professor Adler is the author or editor of 4 books on environmental policy and over a dozen book chapters. His articles have appeared in publications ranging from the Harvard Environmental Law Review and the Supreme Court Economic Review to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. He is also a regular commentator on environmental and legal issues and has appeared on numerous radio and television programs ranging from the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lauer and NPR's Talk of the Nation to Fox News Channel's The O'Reilly Factor and Entertainment Tonight even. So without further ado, I will pass the mics over to the speakers and Michal Moore.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and to Dan very much for having me come back. I've enjoyed it very much, and very much appreciate the forum that you conduct here. It's interesting. I never thought I'd be the only one on a panel who hadn't been on Fox News, but I am apparently. So I'll just say that my remarks are going to address the issues on the outline in 3 ways. And to start, I'm going to go back to some remarks that were made earlier, one by Chris that said the gap between what we know and what we do is all about carbon policy. And I'm going to add to that and say, and the will to do the right thing. I'm going to go back to something that John Felmy said earlier, and that is that there's a great distortion and a gap between transportation energy and electricity. And I think that the failure to close that gap, the failure to address the fact that they are different, even though they use the small e energy, is not helpful, not thoughtful, not accurate, and it sets appropriate regulation back at least a decade. Now, there are good reasons why groups do maintain that gap, do distort the difference, and I think they'll become apparent just in the nature of my comments. So there's a issue here that overlies everything I want to say, and that is that this is all about, this issue of how to deal with carbon is all about risk. But there's very little, but there's a very fundamental issue that distorts our perception about what risk is all about. No outcomes that we can describe, either academically or scientifically, are truly deterministic in this discussion. They're all probabilistic and relative, and yet the decisions that we have to make regarding those tend to change, sometimes pretty rapidly for individuals and firms, and that means that, at least for me as an economist, the rule sets ought to be those that allow the most flexible decisions and closest to the decision themselves. I'm going to try, if I get enough time to do this, I'll try and discuss 3 things. First, this whole topic is about carbon mitigation, and market adaptation. So I'm going to discuss the problem. Why is carbon an issue? Is it the only issue? If we solve it, can we declare victory and just go back to the beach without any SPF 90? What are the main tools that are talked about today to solve the problem? Cap and trade, carbon taxes, some sort of Uber regulation. What are they? Do they work? Should we pick a winner? Should we be in the business of picking a winner? And finally, will energy markets and their consumers adapt? Is there room for a carbon market in all of this? So, first off to the problem, and I will say that the question, is it real, in a sense seems pretty silly to me, but I'll go ahead and attempt it anyway. If it isn't real, something's happening out there. We're getting bigger, wider swings in weather behavior. We're getting a sea level rise that is unmistakable. We're getting melting of fresh water out of glaciers. A lot of things are changing that are due to something. Is it anthropogenic forcing? Probably. Is anthropogenic forcing speeding it up? Undoubtedly. It'd be pretty hard to deny that. So it's a big deal. Most everyone agrees that it's real. I don't know how much cyclicity there is to it or how persistent it's likely to be. But I will simply say that, like any other market activity, to say, oh, I don't believe it, and therefore I won't change my behavior, I won't invest in it, is not just silly, it's foolish. And if you were a money market manager or you're an investor, you're not going to do that. You're going to do what economists call hedging. You're going to bet part of your money that it might be right. Because if you lose wholly, and if you win big, and if it's wrong and you bet against it, then all you've done is to redistribute capital around the economy a little bit. So the right strategy then is to hedge, and if that hedge is wrong, then there's still an investment in the economy, and there are some shifts. Firms that are ossified, been around for a long time, probably didn't deserve to have the market share that they've got anyway, but they got it because they stole land from the Indians or because they got a grant from the government early on. Well, guess what? They're going to fail. And too bad, because the economy isn't going to get more robust, isn't going to grow unless they do. So part of the hedge strategy, if it's effective, is to devise some combination of policies, incentives, programs, R&D that change behavior and change outcomes so as to minimize risk, so as to equitably distribute costs, and to adjust by reacting to changing conditions to minimize imbalance and or disruption in the economy. The business as usual scenario of the existing firm structures, as I said, or stranded capital, are not necessarily left on the table, but they may be, and that's a risk in business generally. So I said that behavior, or I hinted that behavior here in the world of energy and carbon production has to change, and there's two good reasons why. First, there is a real as well as a distributional shortfall coming in terms of what we have available to us in energy, at least energy as we knew it. Second, from what I already said, climate change is a likely event, and that's going to change the dynamic and the calculus, the real calculus, of how energy is produced. There's a couple of reasons why behavior has not changed already. First of all, we subsidize inefficient behavior. We've done that for a long time. We do it under the guise of getting things market ready or market competitive, and then we just forget to take the subsidy off. Second, we have pretty opaque pricing. And as any good economist will tell you, no market works when pricing is not relatively transparent, when the consumers don't know what they're getting, or when, let's just take an example, an electricity company bundles their rates so that you can't determine what you're spending it on, executive jets, vacations, billing offices, or something else that you can't use to change your own behavior. On the public side, the perceived risks of energy development biases the choices for the current mix to known, relatively safe, that's the better the devil you know, technologies and fuels. But that behavior tends to increase the cost, the risk, and the shape of future investment in the system. It gets hard to change. It delays change. It diminishes the reliability of the system overall because we don't bring in new technology where it's needed. And in fact, we reward the same ossified and old 1910 design of the electric system that we have today. Just don't make any changes. The on-demand model that we live with, and I heard someone say this earlier today, one of the environmental representatives, in order to protect the model that we have where everyone can have all the energy they want when they want it, well, isn't that just stupid? That's the on-demand model. That's when I go to the switch and I flip the switch and I expect the lights to come on. If you were living in Iraq today, you wouldn't do that. You'd flip the switch and wait for something to come on and then have it do work for you. The on-demand model implies spinning reserves, surpluses, and a lot of excess production. It's not a smart model, and we're not going to be able to live with it very much longer. We need to change that. So if we admit that there is a problem and we got to change somehow, what about the tools? What do we have available to us? In our toolbox, we could close down all the offending generators, the cars that we don't like, that offend us, all the tuna clippers that should have been shipped to Mexico so they can continue polluting while we pretend that they don't exist anymore. We could change power plants. We could overregulate and redesign power plants and tell them what they ought to look like. We could regulate business by business or across the board, such as a cap and trade plan. We could target offenders using a tax of some kind, a Pigouvian tax that penalizes or changes bad behavior. Like Mr. Nordhaus has proposed recently, we could create an energy tax that raises revenue for the rest of the government, another source of revenue. Like British Columbia, we could redistribute our carbon collection out to other parts of the economy. Like Alberta, we could use the $15 a ton tax on oil sands generation and fund research and demonstration projects. And in California, with the AB 32 fuel standard, we could, in fact, start to push off bad events or bad behavior and keep it out of the state, because, after all, California is an island and doesn't really need to do anything that anyone else does, unless they don't like it. We can get groups together to posit regional behavioral changes, so we can get the Western Climate Initiative, a nice group of friends that work together well until they decide they don't want to work together anymore, and so they stop. Or we could get RGGI and have a nice objective of gas initiatives that don't take account of shifts in technology, shifts in prices, or in fact, the long embedded time for changing technology. So we've got choices, and the two that were determined that we would talk about today are cap and trade, and I'm going to speed through these, and then I'm going to hopefully end on what it takes to get a market to adapt. So what about cap and trade? It's an administrative approach used to control emissions by capping gross levels of some pollutant and allowing companies that can more efficiently comply with a regulation to share, trade, or sell a fraction of their compliance credits to firms that are older, less nimble, and allow them to stay in business. We can use auctions, sales, trades, grants, and you know what? It turns out that it works in very special conditions. Where it got started was down in the South Coast Air Basin in Los Angeles, where you've got a very closed basin, and it was used to regulate criteria pollutants, SOx, NOx, and particle sizes. You could dial down to the industry, every industry, by inventory that was producing any quantity of these. You could then ratchet down your bubble, as it were, or your cap, and get very targeted compliance. When you try to expand that concept out, though, and deal with something that is as easy to miss as carbon dioxide, you have more trouble because you can't pin down exactly where it's coming from. In addition, the vast bulk of it is coming from two sources that are hard to see. One's transportation, and the other are all the range of power plants that it's hard to tie it to, especially if you use some sort of life cycle analysis that uses different ratios of accountability for carbon dioxide for every different technology. Well, cap and trade, at least from an economist standpoint, is, although it isn't really implemented except in a couple of places where it's had some faltering starts, just a non-starter. Again, a silly approach. It's bureaucratic, It's slow, it's artificial in setting goals and prices, and compliance tends to change with political whims. What's that? If you're betting in the financial industry, you're going to bet on the future. You're going to look for something that's got certainty and a return and lowers your risk. You're not going to bet on cap and trade because you're not going to know what bureaucrat's going to be in charge, and you're not going to know what political system is going to ratchet down or change levels over time. It's a political horse trading foil, and for that, unfortunately, it is absolutely perfect. What about taxes? Typically, we all know about taxes, right? It's just about that time, isn't it? 5 o'clock today or midnight today. And so we know what a tax is, we know how it gets administered, and we know how to pay it, we know how to account for it. Some taxes are designed to prevent events. Some taxes are designed just to create revenues, and some are designed to change behavior. They can be used to target exactly the element that we're after. In the case of carbon taxes, we can dial in very, very specifically to some offending constituent, in this case, what ought to be targeted, and I can talk about this, I suppose, in questions perhaps more easily, and that is the carbon atom, and get back down to the most upstream element of what it takes to banish pollution or to fight it in the most efficient way. So what I will suggest to you is that a tax, in the end, is the right way to think about this. Of course, there are good reasons why we don't think about it very much, but it is certainly something that allows us to get the most efficient application of a charge or a change in behavior, if that's what we're really after. So we're dealing with the energy system here, right? It's a non-negotiable system. We can't do without it. We use it in the primary ways that I indicated before. One, transportation. Second, in an electricity system. And energy, small e, also available in the heating system. So we use natural gas for constituent products like fertilizer or plastics, but we also use it for heating and in chillers and things for cooling. Access for that good, small e, energy depends on very capital-intensive investments, which depend on good signals, consistent use. Remember, most of the energy industry has a lifespan that's greater than about 50 years. But it's not always the same machines. The only ones that keep producing efficiently over those long periods of time are things like coal burners and turbines, not foils on wind turbines. They've got a lifespan of about 20 to 25 years, if that. Not solar PV, not solar thermal. They've got limited lifespans under about 20 years. You're constantly replacing that capital. But in each case, you're reminded that this is an extremely capital-intensive business, which means that in the market for energy writ large or by technology, that we've got to have a rule or set of rules that respect the way markets behave. Markets want a reward. Let's go back a half step and say, what is a market anyway? We've all gone to Safeway. We probably didn't pick up a wind turbine while we were back there, but we had a place where we could have an exchange that took place, goods, services, clear at some price for some consideration. They work best when there's a clear rule set, when there's a consistent trading characteristic, when there's transparency in the pricing, when there's enforcement, and when there's equivalency in goods. In other words, when they're efficient, when they're equitable, and when they're effective, especially for a good like energy that we tend to treat not just as a private good, but as a public good. We try and make sure that everybody has access to energy whenever they want or need it. So, with that in mind, and thinking about energy as a set of technologies, as a set of fuels, as a geopolitical agreement between nations, or even between sub-nations like provinces and states, then we've got a good that can only clear and can only be regulated when it's predictable, when it provides some sort of choice. And for electricity dispatch. That choice implies that you've got a range of technologies that satisfy a base load component. It's running all the time at a low cost. Something that's capable of being ramped up and down, that's load following, and something that's got a peaking characteristic. And guess what? They all cost a different amount. They all generate carbon at different amounts. And it means that in order to regulate them effectively, you've got to give not just the public, but the dispatcher, the owner, or those who invest in the technologies a clear choice about what their characteristics are. That means you've got to climb higher and higher and higher up into the stream to get to the more basic product that is the offending product in energy generation. That means that you've got to get to a point where you can be agnostic about how carbon prices get set. That's not a cap and trade system. It's something that identifies the offending element and allows the market to put a price on it and allows the consumer to make a choice about whether or not to consume something that shows up with a higher carbon price versus a lower carbon price, or that has a more effective role in not creating the hazard that we want. So let me just recap by saying that in all of this, carbon is clearly an issue. Climate change is real. And if it isn't real, guess what? The hedge strategy that any of us ought to be adopting in order to imagine the obvious, which is what if it was, tells us that we ought to treat it as a real event. Carbon's real. We can price it. We can regulate it, but not if we always chase the price and intervene through a bureaucratic or a politically adjusted compensation mechanism. And finally, markets can and will adjust if they're given clear signals, transparency, and a real role in allowing a choice by consumers at every level for how regulation regulates and delivers the product that we consume. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope it's not too late in the day to welcome you all to Case Western. I know you've been welcomed many times already today. It's certainly an honor to join you to talk about a very important topic. In climate policy in the U.S.-Canada context, and especially in the U.S. context, is a bit of a sobering subject. It is a tremendous challenge, and it's a policy area that I think many people are not too sanguine about, given the way it's been handled politically in the United States. But I'm hoping that I can give some remarks that might give us cause for some optimism and some reason for thinking that climate policy, not simply in the United States, but internationally, would benefit from taking the opportunity to rethink how we approach this very important issue. I'm going to start, as I said, with looking a little bit at the United States. We have a stated policy goal in the United States of what we refer to as 80 by 50, 80% reduction in CO2 equivalent by the year 2050. We have not enacted that policy into law. To the contrary, Congress rejected anything of that sort, and I think it's fair to say that the new Congress, the current Congress, is far more hostile to that target and a cap and trade bill to achieve that target than its predecessor. Both the stated policy goal and the dominant congressional approach are, in their own way, divorced from reality. Congressional approach is unfortunately divorced from the reality that climate change is a serious problem that we should address, that even if one believes it is not catastrophic, it is not the sort of thing we should ignore. Read some of the books by so-called skeptics closely, and you'll see the debate is not about are human beings affecting the climate. The debate is about how much and what the consequences are and what is it worth to try and stop it. But the stated policy goal is a bit divorced from reality too, because it's divorced from the reality of the sort of transformation economically and environmentally and energy-wise that a goal like 80 by 50 would require. And even more divorced from the reality of the real climate challenge, which is not emission reductions in the United States or emission reductions in Canada or in Europe, but atmospheric stabilization, which requires far more than what would be necessary to achieve 80 by 50. And it's further divorced by reality because the idea that a 1,000-page cap and trade bill of the sort that was passed by Congress could ever meet that goal as a first step is a bit fanciful as well. We need to address climate change. The United States and Canada and other nations need to develop approaches that actually have some likelihood of mitigating the threat posed by climate change and dealing with carbon emissions and increasing concentrations in the atmosphere. But the traditional approach that we've taken to environmental policies of creating yet another regulatory superstructure, this time not on the domestic level but on the international level, is not an approach that's likely to get us very far. It's a mistake. It's an approach, even if we were willing to adopt it, we would not be willing to adopt it with the level of stringency that is necessary to actually achieve the goals we've set out for ourselves. We need to step back and understand the nature of the problem a little bit more before we can have any chance of solving it. But if we do, and I think there are opportunities to do just that, we might actually be able to do so. Now, let me say a little bit more about the politics of this, and I'll talk about the United States because I know the U.S. politics a bit more. But after the elections in 2008, you had significant Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. You had a Democratic president that had campaigned on action on climate change. There was a lot of enthusiasm. There was great expectation. There was a bill in the House, a bill that barely passed, a bill that got 219 votes despite extensive arm twisting, despite loading the bill up with all kinds of pork and lard and set-asides and special treatment that incidentally guaranteed that the bill would not reach its stated emissions reduction target, but additions that certainly made it more politically attractive, and it still could only get 219 votes. It still could not get the votes of every Democrat, and it was dead on arrival in a Senate that had almost a filibuster-proof Democratic majority. Indeed, shortly there in our last election cycle, a Democratic candidate for Senate ran an ad in which he literally shot a version of the bill. For the Canadians who aren't aware of this, literally he was at a range, a copy of the bill was tacked up on a target, he stood there with a gun and shot it. He was elected. He is now a Democratic senator. So the politics are exceedingly hostile to cap and trade. Not simply because it would increase energy prices, not simply because it would have dramatically expanded the regulatory authority of the Environmental Protection Agency, and by some estimates would have required the EPA to conduct 150 separate rulemakings, but also because it was seen as filled with special interest giveaways. It was seen as something that was written in large part by certain very politically influential utilities. It was seen as something that would dramatically increase the size and scope of government without any clear environmental gain. So what's the fallback? Well, legally, the fallback in the United States right now is regulation by the EPA under the Clean Air Act, a decision by our Supreme Court in 2007 called Massachusetts versus Environmental Protection Agency held that the Clean Air Act, as written in 1970 and amended in 1990, adopted a definition of air pollutant that was sufficiently broad to encompass greenhouse gases. So the EPA is moving ahead at implementing that mandate and has adopted regulations for mobile sources and is in the process of adopting regulations for stationary sources. There's a problem, though, and there's a problem that the Supreme Court didn't pay much attention to, which is by the EPA's own estimates, it can't do what it's been told to do. That is to say, when it actually applies the letter of the law that Congress passed to greenhouse gas emissions, it becomes unadministrable. That the permitting requirements, in particular for stationary sources, are such that by the Obama administration's EPA's estimate, the agency would essentially grind to a halt, as would the state agencies that implement air pollution permits. Why do I say this? Well, the number of permits required for something called the Prevention for Significant Deterioration Program, currently about 280 per year. Applying the statutory threshold on emissions to greenhouse gases requires PSD permits for 40,000 facilities. For Title V, another permitting portion of the Act, applying the statutory thresholds, the numerical thresholds that Congress wrote into the Act, increases the number of facilities that need permits from 15,000 to 6 million. According to this administration, right, so this is not a Republican administration's effort to try and get out of regulating. According to this administration, the costs to regulatory agencies alone to simply fulfill these permitting requirements is over $250 million. It's not going to happen. Now, the EPA has decided to try and rewrite the Act, and it's being challenged, and in almost all likelihood, EPA will lose because we have never had a federal court opinion that allowed an agency to do something like rewrite a numerical threshold that Congress enacted into a statute. But maybe a court won't decide that. The House has already passed multiple times resolutions or provisions stripping the EPA of this regulatory authority, and the Senate may do so in the near future as well. So this is an option that may not go forward. But neither this Clean Air Act approach nor Waxman-Markey, as I've mentioned, the House Cap and Trade bill, would achieve the 80 by 50 target. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has been mentioned, isn't on a glide path to come anywhere close to that target. California's Cap and Trade program and proposal may be a bit more aggressive, but it has been at least temporarily set aside in the courts due to challenges by environmental justice groups. And when we look around the world, while we do, as Michael mentioned, see some examples of cap and trade programs that work for certain types of pollutants, as he pointed out, in certain types of contexts, we don't see a cap and trade program anywhere that has set any part of the world on a path towards the level of decarbonization necessary to achieve a target like 80 by 50, let alone atmospheric stabilization. Hasn't happened. Just look at, again, some US numbers. Think about 80 by 50 and get a sense of what we're talking about. We could replace all of the coal in the United States with natural gas. We don't get an 80% reduction in the electricity sector, let alone economy-wide, if we just snapped our fingers tomorrow and said all the coal is replaced by natural gas. If we want to replace just 10% of existing energy consumption with completely non-emitting sources, what are we talking about? Well, to replace 10% of US energy consumption with nuclear power would require close to 150 nuclear power plants. We haven't permitted it or permitted a new nuclear facility in the United States now in, I think it's close to 30 years. It would require 33,000 solar plants. It would require over 100,000 wind turbines. You could mix and match other ways, and certainly nuclear, solar, and wind are all important technologies, all things we need to be part of our energy mix. But this is what the numbers I just gave you are what it would take to just replace 10% of US energy consumption. And we're talking about reducing CO2 emissions 80% by the year 2050 as a down payment on atmospheric stabilization. And we need it not only to do it as a down payment in the developed world, but we need to do it in a way that can enable us to help the developing world to achieve the economic prosperity that they seek in a way that doesn't increase atmospheric concentrations globally. In a time when millions upon millions of people still lack access to cheap energy, something that we take for granted. As Michael noted, we expect that we turn a switch and it comes on. An approach to climate change that does not give those people of the world some hope of having economic prosperity and cheap and affordable electricity, which is part of that, is a non-starter. And we have to recognize, especially as a non-starter, because even the developed countries, even Europe, has been far better at announcing goals and announcing targets than in actually adopting policies to achieve the level of decarbonization necessary to achieve targets. Another way to think about 80 by 50 to see what we're talking about Again, I'll use the U.S. just as a benchmark, but the last time the United States emitted 80%, or the CO2 emissions in the United States were 80% below what they are today, is about 1910. Two things to know about 1910. There are lots of things to know about 1910, but two things that I'll tell you about 1910. One is the population of the United States was only 92 million people. Per capita income was approximately $6,200. In the year 2050, we will probably have over 400 million people in the United States. So per capita CO2 emissions need to be somewhere on the order of where they were in the United States around 1875. I say around because, as you might expect, our data that far back isn't so good. But that's an idea of the ballpark we're talking about. We're talking about a radical transformation of the energy sector. Now, we've seen radical transformations economically and otherwise. So it's not that it's impossible, but it's that we have to recognize that that's what's required. And we have to be a bit sober and humble about the fact that while we've seen those sorts of transformations, we can't really think of many that we've been able to have on demand or that we've been able to orchestrate by government fiat. Fiber optics didn't displace copper to tremendous environmental benefit because we developed a plan to do it. Wireless isn't replacing fiber optics, again, to tremendous environmental benefit because we had a plan necessarily to do it. Certainly government policy affects the rate at which those sorts of things can happen. But we don't have a lot of experience at successfully mandating that this sort of thing happen. In fact, a lot of the mandates that we've tried in these sorts of areas that have been far more modest have been far less successful. California had to rewrite its zero-emission vehicle regs 5, 6, 7 times because the mandates it put forward couldn't be met at a cost acceptable to the people of California. And we've done things like cap and trade plans for things like SO2 emissions, but the emission limits for the acid rain program under the Clean Air Act were written based on what we knew existing technology could do. They were not written to drive technological change. This is a real tough problem. And it's made tougher because kind of underlying all this is that there is what Roger Pielke at the University of Colorado calls an iron law of climate policy, which I think is amply demonstrated by our experience, which is that if we pit economic growth against emissions reduction, economic growth will win. Politically, economic growth will win. So we need not only to think about transforming the energy sector and transforming those aspects of our economy, we also need to recognize that we need to do so in a way that is compatible with economic growth, not simply here, but around the world. And that requires expanding our toolkit, especially given the fiscal constraints that so many of the developed nations now face. And basically what we need to be doing is developing an overall set of policies that are far more friendly to innovation so that we at least have some chance of having the sort of transformation that we need. Well, what would we do if we were serious about innovation? Well, one thing we would do is we'd recognize that our regulatory structure is not always very hospitable to innovation. There's been some talk about wind. I certainly look forward to the day when there are wind turbines on Lake Erie. I used to have an apartment overlooking Lake Erie. I thought I might still be there when they finally went up. But lots of people have had lots of expectations about when we would see wind, especially offshore wind. In 2002, the federal government told the folks behind Cape Wind that they would have full regulatory approval in 18 to 36 months. Today we know that if things go according to the current plan, construction might begin before the end of this year. Why? Well, because we have a regulatory and litigation environment that is not very hospitable to new technologies, not very hospitable to trying to do things in a new way. Regulatory structures developed to constrain nuclear power may not be that much friendlier to solar power if we need large expanses of undeveloped land that may have other environmental values. Offshore regulatory permitting regime designed for offshore oil and gas might not be the friendliest thing for offshore wind. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulatory structure designed for hydropower and hydroelectric dams may not be the best thing for tidal power, and so on. We need to recognize that if we want people to invest, if we want people to try things that are new, that have the potential of being real breakthroughs, we have to make it possible that they can succeed. And we certainly haven't done much of that here or elsewhere. I think also if we want breakthroughs, if we recognize that what we need technologically is not 5% here and 8% there, but dramatic breakthroughs, then we need to reward breakthroughs. And we need to recognize that in the environmental context, a lot of the things we typically use to reward breakthroughs, like intellectual property, like the patent system, are insufficient. If environmental externalities, if emissions aren't priced, if they're not internalized, it is impossible for a would-be innovator to capture the benefit of their pollution-reducing or emission-reducing innovation. The patent system is insufficient, and I think it's, while I agree we need to price carbon, and I'll say something about that in a minute, we're not going to have the level of carbon price that actually would drive the sort of innovation we need, so we need to think about other ways of providing rewards for dramatic innovation. My own view is one thing we need to do a lot more with is technology inducement prizes, and thankfully the Obama administration and folks at McKinsey and elsewhere have begun to pay a lot of attention to the use of inducement prizes as a way of providing super competitive rewards for true breakthroughs. It's something that historically has proven quite beneficial, and something that historically has not been as subject to the same sort of rent-seeking that lots of other ways of funding technological innovation have been. Related to that, and for those that are interested, I have an article just published in the Harvard Environmental Law Review that goes into some detail on prizes. But prizes wouldn't be enough. We need to not only care about innovation, but also diffusion. Diffusion domestically and internationally, finding ways of making sure once something is developed that it actually gets to market rather quickly. The Defense Department actually has a fair amount of experience with using procurement for that sort of thing. You can actually structure procurement rules so they provide a prize-like reward, guaranteeing certain levels of procurement if certain things can be delivered at certain cost. But we also need to be looking at how we can diffuse technology globally. Because if we reduce emissions here, but then sub-Saharan Africa and large parts of Asia simply build lots of coal plants without any kind of carbon capture or sequestration, it's not clear we've actually solved the problem. So diffusion is something we need to pay attention to as well. And I also agree with Michael that pricing carbon and pricing it directly is what we need to do. And here, you know, it's not very often that you hear Americans say there are things to learn from Canadians. And growing up in Philadelphia and given my views of hockey, I certainly feel that, well, after the 70s, I felt that way, for those of you that are from Montreal. But in the area of pricing carbon, we actually can learn quite a bit from Canada. In the United States, we have done a lot with cap and trade. It took us 5 years to develop the rules for that sulfur dioxide trading program under the Clean Air Act. That was a trading program that only covered 400 facilities. It still took 5 years to write the rules. As I understand it, British Columbia was able to implement a revenue neutral, what was supposed to be a revenue neutral carbon tax in 5 months. We're worried about hitting the ground running. A simple program that can be implemented quickly certainly makes a lot of sense. And if we're at a time when we're talking about completely reforming the tax system and reorienting it because of our fiscal troubles, what better time to talk about things that a lot of conservatives have talked about for a long time, which is not taxing income and wealth creation, but taxing consumption. And doing so in a revenue neutral manner. Simpler than cap and trade, it's more transparent, it doesn't produce the same level of price volatility. If rebated on a per capita basis, as folks like James Hansen have proposed, it's not as regressive. It's easier to harmonize cross-border. You don't require the same sort of regulatory superstructure that would be required for harmonizing cap and trade programs. It's less prone to rent-seeking. Yes, our income taxes are a mess, but our excise taxes and our sales taxes, European VATs, in fact, consumption taxes around the world, for whatever reason, and political economy folks don't really understand this yet, are not chopped up and poked through with holes the way income tax regimes are. There is something about consumption-type taxes. I believe it's probably their simplicity and transparency that on the margin makes them more immune to the sort of rent-seeking we've come to expect in the legislative process. And if the carbon tax is fully rebated, there are reasons to believe that it would not have the economic impact of increasing taxes. I know I'm pretty much out of time, so let me talk about one other thing where cross-border cooperation, international cooperation is really important, and where we need to overcome a taboo that we seem to have in climate policy discussions about the things we talk about. And that is adaptation. Because the reality is political process doesn't move as fast as we might like. Mitigation strategies aren't going to move as fast as we might like, even if they began tomorrow. And some degree of climate change is hardwired into the system. Some degree of climate change is inevitable based on what we have already emitted and what we know we will emit. And that's going to have effects. It's going to have effects on water. Certainly the United States and Canada care about water, and certainly that affects our relationship. It's going to affect demand for water resources, the distribution of water resources. It's going to affect how we view the Great Lakes. It's going to affect ecosystems and species. It's going to affect the way we deal with lots of problems, and those problems aren't going to know borders. And when you share as large a border as the United States and Canada do, we need to recognize that some degree of adaptation is something we need to prepare for, and that preparing for adaptation is not failure. It's recognizing that the world we live in is changing, and it's changing at this point whether we like it or not, and that if we don't prepare for that, we and our children are much worse off. So our challenge is, as I see it, to rethink our approach to climate policy. And hopefully this is something that no one country does alone, but that an increasing number of countries and eventually the world community can do, because climate change is a sufficiently important problem that's what's called for. Thank you very much.
Now we've left a fair bit of time for questions.
There have to be questions.
Well, I expect David Crane would have a question.
I think that it's a very good session, first of all. Both the speakers have had something useful to say that we can take away, so thank them for that. We don't often look at the intergenerational aspect of this issue. But the more we delay in doing anything, the greater the problem we are creating for future generations, as we are with fiscal debt when those debts are incurred just to maintain consumption levels of the existing generation. And I think that has to be made more of a message. The thing I took out of this session, more than anything else, is, in which we've heard in other sessions, is the complexity of the issue and the fact that there's no single solution. But I am glad to hear that people have zeroed in on the faults of the cap-and-trade system. It truly is a second-best system. We look at the problems the Europeans have been having with this. We look at all the rent-seeking that occurs. I mean, law firms, banks, accounting firms, traders, they all love this stuff. A carbon tax, which I think you moved to, is so transparent. There's no rent-seeking middleman in there writing contracts or trying to find an exemption or anything else like this. And so that as part of the solution, is it fair for us to conclude that both of you favor a carbon tax of some sort?
I mean, I certainly do.
And I certainly do. And I just want to add one thing to the remark that you made, and that is that thanks to a fair amount of work that we've been doing, for instance, at the University of Calgary, we know what it takes in terms of an investment or a monetary cost to neutralize a carbon molecule in the form of CO2. We're less clear what it takes to neutralize a methane gas molecule. We're less clear what it takes to come to some stable situation with regard to ozone. But the bottom line is that we can approximate what I'll call a neutral cost, or something that neutralizes that atom to where it's not generating harm in one form or another. If you know that, or if you can calculate that, even if you recalculate it later on, then you can assign an equivalency value to that carbon atom. Now you have something, because now at the up end of the stream, you've got the ability to say, look, and I'll go back to what Jonathan referred to in terms of VAT. You can dial in and say, look, at every stage of production, you either add or use the same amount of carbon as the process just before. So when you liberate a carbon atom, make it do some work for you, you release part of that either as heat or as a waste product. You know what it takes to neutralize it, if you're going to fully neutralize it. And so the tax, in a sense, is some fraction of what it costs to make it neutral. You can accept no neutralization. That's a political choice. But you can then assume a regulatory standard or a standard of harm that won't be abridged and simply charge for it. The firms that can produce a product at something under that, i.e. they're very efficient, will do that, and the consumer will reward them by picking that because it'll cost less. It'll have less of a carbon tax embedded in it. So that's a long answer to say that a carbon tax is an efficient method to get there. We have both alluded to the idea why it doesn't get used, and of course the doesn't get used reason is that it's got a word called tax associated with it. So if and I guess that must stem from a whole group of people thinking that every public good or service just comes for free. So we don't actually pay for lighthouses, we don't pay for roads, we don't pay for armies, and therefore we shouldn't have to have a tax. How silly is that?
Let me just make a comment. And remember, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, in I think 1904, said that taxes are the price we pay for civilization. In this case, maybe for survival. But what I've never understood is why conservatives, in particular, who are so much in favor of markets, seem to be the ones most hostile to a tax system, which really leaves everything else up to market responses once you have a price on carbon. I just don't understand why conservatives in particular would be so hostile.
Well, I mean, a couple reasons for hostility. One is, in the United States, most conservatives don't believe that the overall tax burden is too low, and don't believe that the overall level of governmental intervention in the economy is too low. And so the idea of a tax on top of what is already being done, or a massive regulatory program on top of what's already being done, is a non-starter. What is interesting is that the idea of a fully rebated tax, a tax that is essentially shifting tax incidence from income to carbon, doesn't necessarily present those problems. And so, for example, people like Stephen Moore, who's had economics editorial writer at the Wall Street Journal and was one of the folks instrumental in founding the Club for Growth, which is a very conservative PAC that primarily challenges liberal or moderate Republicans in primaries, is in favor of a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Arthur Laffer, the founder of supply-side economics, is in favor of a revenue-neutral carbon tax. ExxonMobil has come out saying they would support a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Some other fairly conservative members of Congress have said so. But the key for them is, think of this as shifting the tax burden away from wages, away from wealth creation, towards consumption, which is also something historically conservatives have said that they very much support. And so the question is there anyone willing to take the stand to say, this is actually something that people have said is a good idea whether or not we're worried about climate. And let's do it because some people care about climate and because other people think it's actually a way to have a more efficient taxation system. I think a deal like that can't be any less politically viable than a Waxman-Markey style cap and trade bill. I believe it would be more politically viable, but until someone actually tries, we don't know. I think people tend to misunderstand the sources of the hostility to carbon taxation as hostility to anything called a tax, as opposed to a hostility to increasing the tax burden, which I think are two different things.
I'm going to elaborate on that and just suggest one other reason, and I'll refer back to a book that was published maybe 3 years ago by Robert B. Reich, the former labor secretary. It's called Supercapitalism. And in a brief part of the middle of the book, he addresses the question of the role, and I'm going to paraphrase what he said by suggesting the word morality, of a corporation. So we treat corporations for tax purposes as a corpus, as an individual, as a human. But in fact, they're not, and they have every incentive to be perverse about decisions that any one of us might take on a moral basis, that is, doing the right thing. There is no right thing for a corporation, or if they exercise it very often, they go out of business because they'd be anti-competitive themselves. So it could be that the conservative interests are framing their constituency as that dominated by corporate interests, and trying to imagine that the decisions or the behavior, the incentives that benefit that group are in fact outside something that includes taxes. Now that's a relatively simplistic view of how to proceed, but you can imagine that if you in fact changed the tax structure that corporations were faced with, especially as far as environmental or social goods, it might change that behavior somewhat. So I offer that as a potential parallel path to what Jonathan has advanced.
And I just have a follow-up question, seeing that I am an other than income tax lawyer. This discussion on the carbon taxes, how do you go about auditing from a government perspective to make sure that the right amount of carbon tax is paid? And from the flip side, seeing that it's something that gets pushed on to the ultimate consumer, and in the United States at least, there are class action lawsuits relating to the incorrect collection of tax. How do you audit this from both perspectives to make sure that who's ever charging the tax is getting the right, doing it correctly? Do you have any ideas on that, or is that the hard part of this?
Well, it's no harder than anything else we propose. So, I mean, if you need a cap and trade system, you need a way to audit the emissions, and you need to audit offsets, which is far more complicated and difficult to do in a reliable way than figuring out energy consumption or carbon-based energy consumption for purposes of a tax. And any regulatory system requires that as well. So, I mean, it's not a problem of carbon taxation. It's a problem of controlling carbon. Requires the government to be better at knowing where the emissions are coming from and from who. But that's a problem that's inherent in any effort to control carbon. My argument would be is that other approaches, such as cap and trade, require additional things on top of that are more complex than the additional things that are required with a carbon tax. And again, I think the one little thing I mentioned that it tries to encapsulate that is it was easier for British Columbia to impose a broad-based carbon tax than it was for a very sophisticated federal regulatory agency in the United States to design a cap and trade program that initially only covered 100 very large facilities and only would ever cover 400 facilities. I mean, you know, cap and trade for a tiny sector took a really long time. Carbon tax across the board took relatively little time. I mean, that encapsulates, I think, the differing level of administrative complexity when you compare the two.
Yeah, you just add one thing to that, and that is this is an accounting matter. So if you take something like gasoline, a derivative of crude oil, we know what the carbon content and the waste is at every step along the way in terms of production. Which, by analogy, if I stretched it out, if I did the CSI example for you, and I started at the gas pump, and then I went back up the pump and straight up into the producing field, I can identify the carbon added. So this is my substitution for what Jonathan was saying of value-added taxes. So think of this as a carbon added analogy. So each time you proceed down in terms of refining, you had to put energy in to transform something. That involved more carbon. So the good at the end represents a lot of inputs that had carbon added. It's not merely, I don't want to belittle the effort involved, but it's a carbon added accounting mechanism, and it's doable. We know how to do that.
Mira, sorry I jumped in before you.
Not a problem. So I agree with I appreciate everything that you pointed out about the immense challenges involved in transitioning to a lower carbon economy. And I also agree with a lot of the advantages that you pointed out regarding a carbon tax versus cap and trade. The one thing I would like to push back on a little bit is the notion that cap and trade is vulnerable to rent seeking, whereas a carbon tax is this pure policy. And two things about Waxman-Markey. One, a lot of the rents that were allocated to certain entities within the bill were allocated in terms of emissions allowances. So basically, the way it worked out was that they weren't giveaways in terms of the amount of economy-wide emissions reductions required. They basically just sort of reallocated the rents from that. The second point is that Robert Stavins has published a paper that shows that a surprising amount of the rents allocated under the Waxman-Markey bill actually did go to consumers, either in the form of direct giveaways, such as the 15% subsidy for low-income consumers, or in terms of reducing prices in some fashion. So those are just two things on Waxman-Markey, and it's probably nitpicking considering that bill is dead. But
just really quickly on that,
in terms of the broader question of cap and trade versus a carbon tax, what prevents Congress from publishing a 1,000-page tax bill that includes the same giveaways of the revenues from that tax as Waxman-Markey included?
Well, a couple things. One is, Waxman-Markey has, the cap and trade, imposing a cap and trade system will essentially have the effects of a carbon tax in terms of increasing energy prices. If you give away the allowances, then it's a carbon tax plus corporate welfare. And that's one of the ways Waxman-Markey was attacked, and I think correctly so. Giving the allowances away to certain groups on anything but neutral basis, I think is fairly characterized as a rent seeking. I think the Stavins paper makes some fairly unrealistic assumptions about the efficiency of some of the government programs that were designed to ensure that consumers benefit from the revenues. And I think that's common in these sorts of analyses. It's not something that I would say he is uniquely guilty of. And there have been other analyses out there. The CBO has a report from 2008 suggesting that a carbon tax is far more efficient than available alternatives as likely to be implemented. And there are other aspects of rent seeking in the Waxman-Markey bill. Some of the regulatory provisions in it have rent seeking aspects to it. The way the offset provisions were designed were made exceedingly agricultural friendly in ways that would have made them very difficult to achieve their goals. And the question about, well, why wouldn't that happen with taxes is a good question. But the interesting thing is when we look at non-income taxes, we look at taxes that are equivalent to a carbon tax, consumption type taxes and excise taxes. Yes, we see some rent seeking, but we don't see the level of rent seeking and carve-outs that we see in income taxes or that we see in cap and trade. And there hasn't been enough research into explaining why that is. As I mentioned before, I believe that the transparency and the simplicity of it make it more or less vulnerable, because one way to think about this is every time you must make a arbitrary administrative judgment about how to implement something, you are creating an entry point for rent seeking. And so the more such judgments you have to make, the more complex a scheme is, all else equal, your system is more vulnerable to rent seeking. And so the question is, why would we not expect a carbon tax to be like the vast majority of consumption and excise taxes we see in developed countries around the world, which is with relatively little rent seeking involved. So I think that's something we should look at. The other thing is that I think politically a carbon tax is only viable if it's revenue neutral. That is to say, if you hardwire into the legislation that all that money is given back, not that it's given into programs that subsidize something else, not that the Department of Energy gets it and buys you new washing machines, that it's actually given back in cash. And especially if that's the underlying design, I think rent seeking then becomes a whole lot more difficult, because then you're not deciding whether or not the benefit goes to First Energy or Washington Gas or the Corn Lobby. It's, do you allow rent seekers to take something that comes out of the check of every American? And that creates a very different dynamic than when you are deciding who among a bunch of insiders and interest groups are getting the rents. So, I mean, that would be another reason I would think you'd get less.
Let me, two things on that. One is, let's just keep the goalposts in mind. Goalposts is not what Rob Stevens is trying to do, which is to redistribute income and make everybody whole. That's not the game. The game is to lower the amount of carbon getting into the atmosphere. And to do that, you've got to have a source of money to fund the technology that actually accomplishes that. So in a sense, you're doing two things with a carbon tax. You're sending a signal that says change your behavior and pick the thing that generates less carbon. And for the things that do generate carbon and have to pay the tax, then you have to get to the point where that tax is allocated specifically to carbon neutralization technologies or techniques. So that gets you away from this issue of whether or not somebody's going to be able to game the system by some other rent-seeking activity that distorts the market. Keep the goalposts in mind.
Dick?
Dick Cunningham, Steptoe Johnson. First, a comment. I think you misjudge the Republicans and why they don't like taxes. It's hard to observe the behavior of the current incarnation of the Republican Party without thinking that their motivation for wanting no tax increases and indeed substantial reductions in taxes is they want to starve the government. They want to reduce the government if they could eliminate everything but military and police power and, well, maybe nothing else. That's what they'd want. End of comment. Two questions. First, and you're going to object to this hypothetical, but as my law professor would say in class, it's my hypothetical, damn it. If you assume there will be neither a carbon tax nor a cap and trade, and your options are input tariffs, substantial subsidies to the production, design, development, and production of green technologies, substantial subsidies to efficiency, that is, you know, like when you get new windows and they're more efficient and keeping the cold in, reduce your heating bill, or do nothing. What's your choice?
So you've created Hobson's choice. I mean, those are all second. But I am. Those are all second order derivatives, and in fact, you're left with what Jonathan said early on. You've only one choice in that hypothetical now to embrace it, and that's adaptation. So without some of these things that actually can do something, all the second order derivatives don't.
Could you just comment on?
I know the answer to that one. None of the above, and get a new group of people to think up the options.
Well, okay.
Oh, I mean,
At some point, a comment on what you
yeah, I mean,
feed-in taxes, but
Oh, you want feed-in tariffs?
feed-in tariffs, yeah.
Oh.
You don't like them,
Well, they don't last. They bankrupt the system, and they're distortionary in terms of economic behavior, and they do promote rent seeking that's non-equitable in the industry. You need more reasons why they fail?
Okay.
I'm not sure why feed. I mean, I can understand the argument that if cap and trade is dead, a carbon tax would have to be dead as well. I'm not convinced of that, but I understand that. I'm not sure why, if they're dead, a feed-in tariff would be viable.
Well, feed-in tariff does. Look at the Chinese. They have used it masterfully to develop a wind power industry, but they couple it with discriminatory procurement, don't allow foreign wind turbine manufacturers to sell there, all that sort of stuff. I agree it's Canada.
But politically, they operate under different constraints than the United States and Canada do. Now, in terms of if I'm allowed to decide how the subsidies for green technologies are to be implemented, then that would be my pick. And the way I would do it is I would take, and my friends in the engineering school should close their ears, take half of DOE budget for climate-related technologies and convert it from ex-ante grants to technology inducement prizes, which, based on our experience, would probably produce a private investment multiplier of somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 1, if not more. And if our goal is really the sorts of technologies that we need that level of investment. That is a level of investment greater than any federal government is going to do. And so if that's the way we can subsidize it, I'd do that, because not a guarantee of success, but it's a roll of the dice with at least some decent odds. It's a positive thing to do. It's a way of generating a lot more investment at much lower costs.
One more quick question. If we have a carbon tax or cap and trade system, and Congress says we'll only do this without, well, would you put on a border tax against imports from countries that don't impose those costs on their competitors to U.S. industries? Then I'd ask Cyndee to bring the WTO case for Canada against the United States when they did that.
I'd be more than happy to.
You'd probably do. I mean, there are other folks that have looked at this far more than I have, but I've certainly the literature that I've seen on this suggests that you could do border adjustments similar to the way you do border adjustments for VAT, and that you could adopt a carbon tax in a way that is completely compatible with the WTO, and do so more easily than you could with cap and trade, unless you believe that you are going to have some international superstructure.
For another day, but I beg to differ with
Well,
you.
Well, we'd see.
Michael Robinson.
Michael Robinson from Fasken Martineau in Toronto. I knew Dick would bring it back down around to a trade dispute that he could get involved in, and Cyndee too. This is not a question, but it's a very short and I think interesting wrap-up to the concept of feed-in tariffs, subsidies for alternative energy, financing thereof, and cross-border energy U.S.-Canada, all in a couple of little paragraphs here. Some of you may have noticed this. In a trade rag that I get called International Project Finance, there's an announcement last month of the first United States Ex-Im bond guaranteed by the United States Export Credit Agency for First Solar, a U.S. company, to raise money to take advantage of Ontario's feed-in tariffs and build and sign feed-in tariff, a 20-year feed-in tariff guaranteed contracts, like a AAA guaranteed contract, of course, because it's guaranteed by the government, that just closed. First Solar is set to use a bond guaranteed by U.S. Ex-Im to finance $450 million forthcoming solar photovoltaic portfolio in Ontario. Deal would be the first use of a U.S. Ex-Im-backed bond for a renewables project, and only the second ever by an export credit agency. And then the writer observes, the bonds would benefit from the highly rated long-term offtake contracts with the Ontario Power Authority and First Solar's use of its own equipment and construction capabilities. And I won't belabor that last sentence, but as we all know, that brings the other trade aspect in that Richard was mentioning, because the Ontario green energy law requires that the equipment used be sourced in Ontario. It's probably illegal. It's being challenged by Japan, the U.S., and the EU. And the way Ontario is going to get around it is stall and drag out that WTO action for 2 or 3 years. By then, they brought in all the equipment manufacturers, and then they'll say, "Oh, we shouldn't have done that. We'll repeal that part." So there we go. Everything all wrapped up in one little bond. That's a lot of money, $450 million, guaranteed by the U.S. government. So a U.S. manufacturer can build equipment in Ontario to take advantage of these hugely generous feed-in tariffs. Maybe the way of the future.
Now, I'd like to thank Michael Moore and Jonathan Adler for a very interesting, thought-provoking discussion, and I actually think that there are a number of sound bites that we all can use for whatever position we want to take on this topic when talking with clients or politicians or whomever. We've got a quotation: we have to rethink the approach to carbon policy. Energy is a public good. These things are divorced from reality, and both speakers use the words, this is a non-starter. So I think that this particular presentation, when transcribed, will be useful to many of us in the room. So thank you very, very much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to adjourn the session, but also to direct you just upstairs. The stairs are on either side, just around the corner, to free drinks reception that starts immediately when you arrive. Thanks very much.